conference. So on behalf of all of the partners today, I'd like to welcome you to this conference. And what we hope is that the next 5, 6, 7 hours are really valuable to you. And so I really encourage you to ask questions, be engaged, spend the time at the end to actually speak to the individual speakers one-on-one. Because this really is a conference in response to comments that you gave us after last year's conference of things that you wanted to learn additional things about or to move forward. And my slides won't move. Can you move them forward? So just to put this in a little bit of kind of perspective for you, thinking about it as a person who spent the last 30 plus years, even though I started my research career, by the way, at the age of 5. But the last 30 plus years involved in clinical and translational research. And it really was only about 15, 16 years ago where we actually began to think about translational science as its own discipline. And it was really defined in this JAMA article in 2002 as the effective translation of new knowledge, mechanisms, and techniques generated by advances in basic science research into new approaches for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of disease that is essential for improving health. And certainly when you think about that, that's what all of you are engaged in. That our ultimate goal is to take basic science discovery, bring it to the bedside, understand if it's efficient in efficacy, and then take it into populations and ultimately have that adopted so that we improve the outcomes for patients not only here in the United States, but ultimately across the globe. Next slide. And as a land-grant institution at The Ohio State University, I'd say this really is a fundamental mission of Ohio State, so that we have a large amount of activity in our basic science laboratories. Here we are in the BRT. So new discoveries are being made on a regular basis. And we take those discoveries and we begin to think about how do we actually use that information to take it over, to develop either new methods that actually help other people to develop their types of techniques further, or to move it forward into new diagnostics, new therapeutics, or in fact new preventive strategies that can impact human health. Next slide. But I think all of you recognize that this concept of moving from discovery to clinical research to that health services research, understanding how it impacts clinical practice and ultimately into population health, is a long and arduous process. So it ends up that analyses have suggested that from that original concept, identifying a target, all the way to bringing it across to actually being a new therapeutic advance takes more than 17 years. And not only does it take a long time, but the overwhelming majority of the things that we think are great ideas end up failing some way along that pathway. And part of that is because it's absolutely critical that we're designing our studies, that we're thinking about the types of things that we do that constantly ask the questions, are we doing this in the most efficient and effective? Is this going to make a real difference in outcomes? And to think about that from every perspective. It's not just a linear process, and in the past we actually used to think about this more as an incremental, but I think as things have begun to change over the last decade, we're actually we've moved more into things that are actually parallel processes. And so I know that you're going to hear some speakers later in this morning that are going to talk about some of the things that you can do that will really facilitate your research and make it better able to stand up to the regulatory overview that's critical in terms of supporting this type of activity. It's also important that you remember that translational science, or clinical and translational science, is team science. And so no one individual can do it alone, and it really requires research teams, not only investigators and scientists, but in fact clinical research coordinators, research nurses, biostatisticians, informaticians, investigational pharmacists, people who do some of the additional toxicology. And so it's really bringing together this incredibly large team and making sure that those handoffs of information that we share across these translational divides and that we learn from each other, that it doesn't only become unidirectional, but in fact it's bidirectional and multidirectional to actually be able to facilitate. But it's all based on this foundation of actually regulatory affairs and regulatory science. So if we are actually going to significantly impact the human condition, it's critical that we do this in a way that is the safest and the most effective, and that we ultimately protect the outcomes for both human patients as well as animal patients. Next slide. And so the FDA's mission in really kind of overlooking this has transitioned from that which you see in the bottom of the slide, which is to protect the public health by assuring safety, efficacy, and security in products that actually impact health, now to really taking on this concept as well, together with the FDA, the National Science Foundation, CITI, and others, for really rigor and reproducibility. So I think you've all heard about it. But they really want to be working together in partnership with us, because ultimately what all of us care about is actually moving forward the things that we're working on in a way that most importantly impacts the individuals whose lives that we're trying to improve. Next slide. And it's important to recognize that the breadth of the FDA is incredible. So we're going to focus primarily today on the middle part of the slide in terms of drugs and therapeutics, but recognize that 25 to 26% of the GDP is actually regulated by the FDA. That's kind of an overwhelming number when I saw that on Rob Califf's slides from a presentation that he did a little more than a year ago. So from cosmetics to food and cigarettes, and certainly there's been a lot of interest over e-cigarettes and the impact of that, all the way through ionizing radiation, veterinary medicine, and foods, all the way to some of the newest advances, which include things like CART, cell therapy, which many of you might recognize, new biologics, which has become some of the hottest areas, and of course DNA, including some of the CRISPR-Cas9 work that's going on and moving forward to having the first therapeutic trials. These are the kinds of advances and things that the FDA is involved in oversight. So what's our goal for you today? Again, what I said at the very beginning is we're really responding to things that you asked for after the last conference. A little bit more in-depth information regarding some of the aspects of moving forward through the FDA process, additional kind of information, some hands-on things that you can begin to take back to your own activities to actually improve things, and an opportunity to work. And so we focus moving from actually some new things that are available that many of you may not have a lot of experience with, is how do we optimize and really kind of move forward that trajectory in that preclinical space. And Dr. London, who has joint appointments at Ohio State University and Tufts, is really going to talk about leveraging spontaneous disease in veterinary patients to optimize drug and device development. Moving forward to Chris Schilling, who's in the back, who's going to talk a little bit more about really preparing academic science for FDA review, so focusing on IND and IDE and some of the things that you need to be thinking about in that regulatory purview. And then Dr. Jones and Jester. Dr. Jester's a new faculty member with us, so welcome to The Ohio State University. Is really going to talk about some of the new concepts of actually how you do quality management and then how you develop those quality management plans to be able to actually oversee far more effectively the research that you're doing. And then lastly, and this is important, this is inspection. And not necessarily audit. So I made sure that we had the language correctly is talking about how you do that kind of overall monitoring and how you prepare for those kinds of site visits, kind of a primer of moving through. So again, I thank all of you for attending today. Again, I hope that this meets your needs. There'll be follow-up, and Rob will talk about, I think, later, conferences, I think, in 2 weeks.
Yeah, June 19th.
And that are going to be more hands-on, and some of the things that are involved in that one on IND and IDE, actually packet preparation and the things that you need to move forward. But I think one of the things is that really that the CCTS is here for you as a resource and to work with. And I always go back, I think, to what I think is one of the most wonderful quotes by Henry Ford, which is coming together as the beginning, keeping together as progress, and working together as success. I wish you all success, and I wish you a wonderful conference. Thank you for attending, and of course, go Bucks.